Today I'm going to be talking, well, it's basically like two talks cut in half and then squashed together. First half deals with the introduction of a new Corpus tool designed specifically for Corpus-based language teaching / data-driven learning, the Corpus-based platform. The second half of the talk kind of addresses whether we still need tools like this for corpus linguistics in general, given the fact that we now live in the post-ChatGPT era. The talk was originally designed for like 90 minutes, so I'm going to try and race through in an hour, but we'll see how we go. So I imagine most of the people here in the room have some experience with language corpora, whether that is in the fields of research, whether that's for teaching, learning, material development, corpus linguistics, analog history, and all of these different areas of education. My area, though, where my research interests and teaching interests are focused is here, where the interaction between the teacher and the learner, so-called data-driven learning, which has been around for since the 1990s, but which has seen a really dramatic rise in the number of papers published, the number of initiatives undertaken over the past decade. So for those of you who aren't familiar with data-driven learning, this slide kind of explains a little bit about how it works. But essentially what it is just combining corpus linguistics techniques, experience with data with pedagogical applications, whether that's in its indirect form through the use of corpus-derived teaching materials, or in direct form with direct hands-on use of language corpora by language teachers and or language learners. From a theoretical perspective, at the individual level, the theories involved in more constructivist focused language learning, where learners take on multiple sources of information, whether that's language data, statistical information about language use, frequency information, patient information, and so on, and apply that to their own learning. But when used in classroom context, we also get the additional benefit of socio-cultural approaches to language learning, whereby peers can work together, teachers and peers work on scaffolded instructional materials to focus on forms and a whole range of other, as yet largely untested benefits purported at the cognitive level. For example, does data-driven learning make you a better learner in general? It's one of the things that researchers like Alex Bolton might talk about, and there's still a lot of work to do in this area. We know that it works for language learning, but it may also have other knock-on benefits on other areas. How does it work at a very basic level? The traditional DDL, I suppose, is the reading of a derivation of manipulation of concordance lines. So it's the most typical kind of corpus output you get. You query a term, you get some results. You may then sort those results. You may change the order, but it's essentially close reading of keywords retrieved from corpus searches with some surrounding context, whether this is presented in keyword in context form, whether it's presented in sentences. And the idea is that by viewing concordances, you are exposing yourself to some of the statistical regularities of how that word is used, what words appear together with those words, what kind of context that word is found in. And that information can be incredibly useful. As corpus tools have gotten better and increased in functionality, we increasingly get statistical information, frequency, visualizations, parts of speech, for example, as you can see here, and even sort of more recent corpus tools prefer more visual sources of information, which can be very useful, particularly for lower proficiency students or for students for whom reading concordances may not be an attractive or appealing concept. So the main focus of today's talk was to talk about disciplinary uses in terms of kind of mission and the center, perhaps, if that's some of the things that you're doing in terms of English for specific purposes, disciplinary approach to corpus using in higher education. I've got a lot of skin in the game here, having come through Hong Kong U in between 2014 and 2017, working under Professor Ken Hyland there, which is one of the leading centers in disciplinary or English in the discipline subjects, producing the monograph, learning the language of dentistry, working with dentistry students as well as general and science thesis writing programs and thesis writing programs for the humanities. So we know there's been a long and storied history of corpus use in those areas, but we do know that the field of data-driven learning still not necessarily reached mainstream consciousness. And researchers like myself, having gone through numerous innovations, numerous kind of projects, we are kind of well aware that there's still a lot of work to do to convince the kind of general public that using corpora is going to have benefits for your language learning and teaching. You see there in the middle part, kind of the recurring theme is that corpora and EDL sound really cool, but, and then there's a kind of whole list of buts that might come with that. These might include certainly the level of technical proficiency required to operate most commonly available corpus tools. Corpus can be tricky is one of the titles of a research paper that came out a couple of years ago. You only need to read the title of the paper to get a sense of what's happening in that. A lot of this can be caused by user interface. I mean, in fairness to corpus tool developers, most of the time it is a one-person show. So the more popular tools like Encom, for example, a person, a LexTutor, a person. Sometimes these may be corpus linguists, but do not necessarily have a background in these fairness. The way that you access and consult these tools may be quite different from the way that you might Google something, which you can do in 5 seconds. Not only that, but then we read a lot of studies, and I've probably rejected a fair number of studies that have come in to journals as reviewers where the corpus data itself then is not suitable for the target audience. So maybe you're working with younger learners, but you're then using corpus data that is aimed at adults, or you're working with lower proficiency learners using corpus data that's probably too high. So this kind of came to a head for me. One of the things that I was doing in Australia when I got there, and one of the things that I think my research is well known for in the area, is my attempts to bring BBL, corpus-based language teaching, outside of university settings. So I had conducted a project in 2021 trying to introduce a BBL intervention into a local secondary school. I did a workshop there through an MA student, and kind of left it open for teachers to get in touch to say, okay, you know, write me if you want to work with me on something. The science teachers who were training their students to write research reports got back to me and said that their students had great trouble with passive voice. This applied to both second language users of English as well as monolingual users of English. They kind of understood how to make the construction, but would often get the wrong form of verb, or not know when to use active and when to use passive according to different sections of research reports combined. So the study was published in 2022, Crosthwaite sequels in computer-assisted language learning. We gave them pre and post tests. Everything was good. They all had a great time. They all learned how to use the passive, massive success. But then when we messaged them 3 months later to say, you know, are you still using corpora? Are you still doing data-driven learning? 18 students got back to us in a follow-up survey, and of these, only 4 reported that they were still using corpora. The students' reasons for discontinuing corpus use seem here on the right. Namely, I don't know how to use the tool properly. I prefer Google. I can't understand the results. So obviously quite disappointing. But it's actually a fairly common result when follow-up studies have been done on people who have undergone BBL interventions. So not entirely surprising, if a little disappointing. So I took it then upon myself to say, okay, we can't just keep doing this. We can't just keep having the same problems. What do we need to do? Maybe we need to develop a new tool. So had some money lying around, which usually never happens, but I actually had some money lying around from some other things I did. And I contacted the gentleman here on the left, that's the advisor. He has a great experience and history of developing corpus tools, for example, Sketch Engine for language learning, or SKEL. He's also had a hand in developing the original Sketch Engine platform. He worked on Versatext, which is Jamie Thomas's corpus tool, which again is a really useful tool. So I reached out to him and said, look, we've got to develop a tool that is basically as easy as possible and that can help meet the needs of these secondary school students that we are working with in Australia. So that's where the CorpusMate platform was derived from. Now, for the people who are listening online, what you need to do is go to corpusmate.com, and you can just have that open in a side window. Check that out. I don't have time today to actually kind of go through different functions step by step, just given the time constraints, but I'll describe the main functions of the tool, and then you can go and have a play with them yourself in your own time. So that's the way that we're just going to run today's session. Now, I'll start by describing the data in terms of what is underlying the Corpus tool, CorpusMate. And we've essentially selected 6 corpora, although this is still a kind of work in progress. And it is our aim to add additional text, particularly those that are more suitable for lower proficiency language learners trying to get graded readers in particular, starting about the A2 level CFR all the way up to C2, and then we'd be able to certify proficiency later on. But certainly, we've got a range of academic versus general English corpora. So the British academic with English corpus is in there. That's very commonly used in the Sketch Engine platform, together with the Elsevier open access science corpus, which is an open access collection of scientific articles. So across a range of different disciplines there. Then a corpus of spoken data, including BNC 2014 spoken, TED Talks, and so on. Simple English Wikipedia, which if you aren't sure what that is, it's basically a version of Wikipedia where people upload entries that are written for language learners of the intermediate level proficiency, I imagine. So they cut out of some of the more complex grammatical structures, trying to simplify some vocabulary. Makes it a really useful resource. And then some transcriptions of learning videos from the BBC. So together it makes about a 50 million word collection of written and spoken and data. In my own opinion, still a little bit too small, and that's why we're trying to increase the size so that we can increase the kind of the range of results that we can retrieve when we people queries of quite specialist. But that's data. So for those of you who are looking at the platform on your screens, I'll talk through some of the main functions of how that works. And the approach taken to concordancing is fairly novel, I guess, in that it was stolen from the West. So this actually uses functionality that was introduced in the latest version of Hancock by Lawrence Anthony. And then in discussion with Lawrence Anthony, decided to basically use the same kind of approach whereby the concordances are not presented in an alphabetical order according to the keywording context or the context that's provided here on the right. Most corpus tools will give you a search term and then the next lines in the concordance will be sorted alphabetically, but even Lawrence has realized that even from a research point of view, it's not necessarily ideal because what you really want is you want to know what the most frequent combinations of words are that go together with the words that you're searching for. So instead of having to go through multiple steps to get that information, rather the concordances are now presented in a way that the most frequent 3-word combination that follows the search term is displayed first in the list, followed by the second most frequent, the third most frequent, fourth most frequent, and so on, with some color coding to kind of make that more visible from an input processing perspective. And by displaying also only one hit for that most frequent combination, what you also do is avoid overloading the viewer with too many results. So say, for example, you get a 4-word combination that appears 200 times in corpus. Ordinarily, you would see only that when you search for it and try to scroll down, but then that's overwhelming for the user. So we essentially nest them line by line, and then you can click on the little downward arrow here then to see the individual results for that. So say there's 26 hits for that one, you would click that, and then you would see the 26. That's how that works. So thanks, Lawrence, for allowing me to steer. So, as I already mentioned here, if you click on the down arrow, this will then allow you to see the results that are hiding behind the nest. So we've taken the first hit here, qualitative assessment of the, which appears to be the most frequent three-word combination that appears after qualitative. I then click that, and then you can see those results here. There were 6 or 7 of them, and then that allows you to see the hits for that. And then, of course, these are clickable, and they will take you to those results. Another kind of often cited complaint of concordancing software is that you are limited to the context that is viewable in the window. So very often you might get half a sentence or a scrap of something, and you want to see more of that. People often have said to us, I want to read more of where that word is, I want more context. So that's something that in CorpusMate we've integrated an expand button into the sentence view, which is the other way of viewing concordances aside from what we call pattern view, which is your traditional keyword in context view. And by clicking on the expand button, which appears at the end of the sentence, as you can see here, that then allows you to retrieve more of the context for that term. I believe you can click on it about 5 to 6 times before it kind of gives up. But at the very least, you will have something almost at the paragraph level or paragraph level to see where that word is used. That's something that a lot of users have asked for, and that's something that we try to provide. Now, one of the good things about knowing the data is that we can then know for a number of the scientific texts, for example, that we can generate citations for any concordance result. That's something that even the secondary school students are asking for. Their result, and I then cite it from somewhere. So we, by providing the metadata, you can press a button that will allow you, it will take the title of whatever the paper is. It will then allow you to jump straight into Google Scholar with that as a search result, and that would then 99.97% should be the top hit that shows up. So it sends it straight to that paper, and then they can use the citation functions within Google Scholar to allow them to do that. We also have the option to allow them to translate the query term into heading straight into Google Translate. By default, it's set to Mandarin Chinese, pretty much the language of most of the students that we're working with in Australia. But then the user has the option to specify any language that they want this to. So that's again something that was requested by these secondary school students, something that we weren't necessarily expecting from them. It allows you to tailor the tool to their specific needs and requirements. Various search options are possible, but we did try to not make it overwhelming, because again, that's one of the most frequent complaints about data-driven learning is that the query terms were too difficult. I had to use like code, I had to use parts of speak tags which I don't understand. So we just try to keep things as simple as possible. We have wildcard searches that can appear in place of words, and then also to replace parts of words as well. And for those of you who are looking at the CorpusMate platform right now, you might, for example, query the word academic, add the wildcard after the word, click the compare results tab at the top of the screen, which you'll be able to see, and then you'll be taken to a visualization of the words that will appear in that wildcard slot, together with some indication of their percentage hits in the corpus for that one. So again, it's fairly simple, and you only have to click on the one button to get that information. We also have a slash function, which allows the CorpusMate platform to essentially query two terms at the same time. Unfortunately, it only works without putting the spaces in, so that's something that some people have said is a little bit tricky. But one of the things here, if you have the term emphasize /the, it will then do search for both at and the. And then when using the compare results function again, you'll be then taken to the visualization of which term is the more likely to appear in that slot. So then from a teaching point of view, you can make a number of activity buttons, like which word is more likely to appear in this word, which is this word more likely to appear than the other one. So that's the slash function. And then the question mark one is, basically does a check for the presence of the word and then query term without that word there. So then you can ask questions like, do we need this word in this sentence? And I always use this one because I remember I built a learner corpus of student writing at Hong Kong when I was there. And this was the #1 ranked error in that course. To emphasize on something, they always put the preposition emphasize on this. So this, what this does is it allows you to check, is it emphasized on or is it just emphasized the? Again, going to the compare results function will then give you a pretty reliable indication of that. So those are the three kind of main functions, wildcard / question mark. That's pretty much it. And then for the vast majority, 99.9% of users of CorpusMate, you will never need any more than that. So sometimes I get asked from other researchers, like, yeah, but why don't you put this in the part of speech? I say, yeah, but you're not the one using it. Okay, so great. We also have some other kind of visualization options. Some of these were taken from or influenced by some other tools. So I just want to reference Jason Chang's lingual tool here. Then we also have some other visualizations, for example, about register, comparing presence of terms in written and spoken mode. So that's that. The pattern finder tool essentially does what the keyword in context concordance result gives you the next to the little down arrows, but this time you can just instantly view that information as statistical information with count, and then you'll be taken straight to that. And then of course all of these results are clickable, so then all you have to do is click the word and it'll take you straight to the results for that. That's the pattern finder tool. Then, of course, of interest to today's talk is the discipline specificity of searches, and this is accessed through the topic distribution tab. And also from the main CorpusMate menu, you can specify the discipline through which to limit the corpus queries. There were 20 subjects that were, we had originally started with about 35, but then it's not overwhelm the user. A number of these were condensed into individual categories. For example, geography, agriculture, and environment appear as one result instead of three separate ones. But these are basically 20 very common school or kind of undergraduate, graduate level topics. And we allow you to then see at a glance whether a given term that you're searching for is more or less likely to be found in that discipline. So disciplines where we have a blue arrow, the query term that we've used here would mean that those terms are more likely to be used in that discipline. And then when we have the red arrow, those terms are much less likely or not likely to appear in that discipline very much at all. And this is worked out through a statistical calculation that takes into account differences in individual corpus sizes among these subject areas. So it seems to work pretty well. Also, we do embed a little bit of guidance for language learners as to what happens when you get no results, and very often that can be the case. But rather than just leaving them hanging, like why am I not getting any results from my corpus, we at least try to give them some explanation about why that might be. Maybe there's a spelling mistake. It could be the case that what you search for is not specific to that area. It could be that you may need to think about how to rewrite the search to get more results. It could be that you've written with an error or so on. So just a little bit of guidance for the user there. It might seem like a small thing, but when you're working with people who never used the corpus before, this is the kind of information that they want to get on a first use. It's comforting and makes them feel like they're not just dumb, but there's an extra step they need to do to get the information. So we're running pretty well here. The number of use cases already, we've already integrated the use of the CorpusMate platform into the EAP courses that I run at the University of Queensland. We've also mentioned use of the platform on the massive open online course versions of these EAP courses that I also set up there as well. But for those people on the full credit programs, both for the undergraduate and graduate level EAP courses, there is a 1-week module on Corpus use data-driven learning. This includes other tools besides CorpusMate, but CorpusMate now goes bigger on this content. So these courses are taken by hundreds of students each semester, so that's a positive sign. These are some of the questions, for example, that we might use in workshop on Corpus use, so just getting students used to using the functions of the Corpus platform through some kind of guided activities, scaffolding questions. They would sit in groups and work on answers to these questions together. Some of the graduate level one is a little bit more involved, but overall, students so far pretty supportive of it. Always do mention in the qualitative comments that they appreciated being shown corpora. They appreciated having access to these tools to help them with some of the issues that they were having. So that's good. And then, of course, one of the other main areas of my research over the last few years is the training of teachers in corpus-based language pedagogy, data-driven learning. And that's one of the reasons I'm here in Hong Kong, invited by Angel Ma over at EDUHK to work on a project related to teacher training of Corpus use. This paper came out last week in TESOL Quarterly. This is one where we did a teacher training program in Vietnam. This is involving the CorpusMate platform. We trained them in the use of the tool, and then we also provided training in integrating the use of the tool into lesson planning practice. We then analyzed lesson plans that were written in groups from teachers for their successful integration of at least one Corpus-based activity into their lesson plan. Overall, not so great, but then you have to remember this is like the first time they would have done this, and with a little bit of extra training and a little bit more guidance on how to really integrate the materials, we would hope that that would be something that they would continue to do in the future. So, right on cue, we now get into the second half of the lecture. Which is kind of, okay, great, you spend all of this time and money and effort with all of these Corpus tools, but there's a big elephant in the room. And then suddenly, Corpus linguists, and pretty much everybody else is suddenly saying, well, we're all out of a job now. We've got generative AI, ChatGPT, we're all done. We're all just going to be out of a job and we should all go back to manual labor, something like that, right? The sky is falling and so on and so on. But, I mean, we're all still here as of this point in time. So it hasn't happened yet, but will it do so? And one of the things that was interesting to me as a corpus linguist is to say, okay, great, this is good. People are talking about language. Finally, people are talking about language data. They don't know what it is, but they're talking about it. They're talking about statistical models of language. And they don't know what they are, but they're talking about them. Corpus linguistics, like myself, we've been talking about this stuff for years. Nobody cared. Certainly people who fund large government projects didn't care, because we've been applying for years and never got any money out of them. But now they're throwing money because we're doing generative AI. So this is the claim I was trying to make. Language data, in other words, corpora, are back in vogue. We are popular, for want of a better word. Yet, corpus linguistics as a field is still at a crossroads. There's a lot of people who are worrying, are we all out of jobs and so on. And we also kind of resent having our thunder stolen by these NLP guys, these generative AI experts who suddenly, we've been doing this for years, but now they're the rock stars, right? So we've got to put they've captured the imagination of the public in a way that we have been trying to do for decades now. So what have I been doing last year? Not doing very much corpus linguistics at all. I've been going into schools with people from the education department, and we've been training teachers, not just language teachers and teachers from every subject, on prompting generative AI and collecting information about their use cases, about what they might use generative AI to do. This includes the use of generative AI for lesson planning, feedback, content creation, assessment, and something they call, I don't know if they use the same term here, but it's differentiation. So it's where you take content or instructional strategies that are designed for, say, advanced level learners, and then you modify them for lower level learners or those with specific disabilities, those who speak English as an additional language or dialect, and so on. So it's a kind of constant revision of your teaching materials and practice in order to be able to get everybody on board. And it's a huge issue in Australian education. There are people whose job is just to do that. They differentiate for the learners. But in corpora and DDL, we've been doing these things for some time. So it's not entirely alien concept to us, but teachers are using generative AI to do these things, but not necessarily using language corpora corpus linguistics. So the question that I posed in the paper that was published in Applied Corpus Linguistics, which I just inherited together with Paul, is that are we at risk of irrelevance? Who would want to use my wonderful CorpusMate platform now? Should I just kind of delete it, throw it in the bin, go back to my bedroom and cry somewhere? Or is it really the end of data-driven learning? Is there still a place for corpus linguistics in the ChatGPT era? What can we do to ensure that the field is stable and valid in the years to come? So the first thing you have to do is basically think about what generative AI is, and then think about how corpora can still provide advantages over the use of generative AI. And that's what I set out to do in that paper by making the case that generative AI is essentially corpus linguistics on steroids. And that's the way that I explain what corpus linguistics is now to other people. Because as a corpus linguist, very often you go out to dinner with someone and they say, okay, what do you do? I'm a corpus linguist. What's that? Oh, we use language data to do X, Y, Z, and you can do. Oh. But now if you say like, oh, you know generative AI, check. Well, what I do is a bit like that, but like the baby version. Okay. But at least that's something you can kind of go, right? That's not too bad. But then I sat down and thought about it, and Eric and Paul asked, what, come up with something, come up with a way to save us. Corpus linguists, we need saving at the moment. And I sat down and thought about some of the things that I learned over the course of the year when I was working with these Australian teachers on generative AI, not thinking about corpus linguistics. What are some of the issues that we were having with generative AI that we wouldn't necessarily have? So I'll go through each of these in turn. The first one is knowing the data. CorpusMate, I know pretty much exactly every single text file that is in that. And you can point at the individual concordance level to that file. And that's something that's incredibly useful. We know exactly the domain of text from which corpus data is derived. We know the texts that are included, and we know what texts are not included. And having this knowledge is really important because we cannot say the same thing for generative AI. We have next to no idea about the training data that it is built on. We have no idea about the current state of the data, what's in or out. So we are left to make an assumption about what the underlying data is. And for a number of people, that is risky. And other people who use DIY corpora, for example, or self-built corpora, learners can claim, in my words, kind of complete ownership over the corpus used for subsequent queries. That's something that they cannot say that they can do with generative AI. Generative AI, they could say, gave me like 20 examples of this word in context from this discipline, but they don't really know if it comes from that discipline or not, or whether it's an estimation of what they think might appear in that. That's an edge issue. Authenticity as well. And one of the main things that people say in data-driven learning articles is that one of the main selling points of data-driven corpus linguistics is that the data is authentic, in that it was actually produced by a person at some point in time. So even if it contains an error, or even if it contains a stylistic kind of marker, at the very least, you can know that it was generated by a person. However, you cannot say the same about generative AI, and very often it will produce things that look like something that somebody might say in context XYZ, but then if you ask somebody from context XYZ, is this something you would really like or do or say or believe or think? And they say, no, we never say. Generative AI doesn't know that, but it will give you the impression that it does. So the claim here is that corpus data, as language actually produced by humans, is a more reliable indicator of real language in use. And for second language learners, having that knowledge is actually really important, in that they can trust they can trust the data. They can trust the things that they're asking that are going to be true insofar as they are representative of what's in that book. So, authenticity. A huge issue then for generative AI, which is just the nature of the beast, is replicability. If I search for something in CorpusMate, I will get exactly the same results every single time. You cannot do this in generative AI due to the way that generative AI is set. And you can claim, oh, I'll change the temperature settings or whatever, but it just simply does not work like that. And if you're in a classroom situation where you need to be able to replicate the findings for all of your students in your class, and you need it to do it consistently, generative AI will fall over every time. So, a paper that I've submitted to Journal of Second Language Writing at the moment, not corpus related, but it's about second language writing, written corrective feedback. And we compared human written corrective feedback against computer generative AI generated written corrective feedback. The humans all tend to give written corrective feedback in the same way. So red pen here or there, some direct correction, some indirect comments like, why don't you think about this, or this is in the wrong order. And there's some individual variation, but on the whole, you give the students written work to a teacher and they will give you something that's largely the same each time, whether it's useful or not. However, when you input the same student's work and the same prompt into ChatGPT, it will give you completely different forms of feedback each time, even if you tell it kind of some of the parameters of that feedback to provide. So, for example, here we've asked ChatGPT to provide written corrective feedback on this text, and it's highlighted some preposition errors as things for correction. But then if you give exactly the same text, same prompt, ChatGPT in another chat window, then you will get completely different approach. So then if you've got 30 students in your class and you all want them to have the same kind of written corrective feedback, you're going to be spending a very, very long time fighting with ChatGPT to give you that. So that's a major problem. Safety as well. One of the main things that teachers in Australian schools, and probably same here in Hong Kong as well, are worried about is safety. From the perspective of data privacy is absolutely a huge issue for them. So that's like a sackable offense if they're uploading students' work into ChatGPT or they're going to get in trouble. So that's a major issue. But not only that is that in the corpus data, if you know the data and you know what's in there, and with CorpusMate, something I should have mentioned is that we did add a profanity filter using natural language processing techniques to try and remove any references to, say, bad language, sexual or drug use, things like that. But in ChatGPT, you have no idea what it's going to say to these children. It could be saying something completely inappropriate, and as a teacher, you have no real control over that. So, ethical, legal safeguards, sensitivities about personal data, all of these things are huge minefields for your average teacher who's wanting to use generative AI in their teaching practice. Corpus linguistics, on the other hand, is safe as a practice. And you can be pretty sure that you don't need to upload data, you don't need to provide your details, you don't need a credit card, that kind of thing. You can take a tool like CorpusMate and just run with it. Okay. I realize I'm approaching the end of time, so I might have to cut off a little bit short. Hallucinations as well, something obviously that is factored into generative AI. You can't really get around that. But at least with corpus data, yes, sometimes the data may contain errors, it may contain issues, but at the very least, through appropriate data cleaning and preparation, you can probably overcome the vast majority, because you can't really do this using generative AI. And probably the most important is that, and I'm sure you've all had this conversation yourselves at university, is at least with corpus-use data-driven learning, the student is active in the process. They are querying things, they're looking at the output, they are doing everything they need to do to get the brain going. Generative AI, what are they doing? They put the question into generative AI and they just copy and paste the answer straight out. So it's an incredibly passive approach to learning that corpora and DDL, for all of their faults, and we know that we do have faults, you still have to be actively engaged with the corpus software. You have to be engaged with the language data in order to succeed in those tasks. Can we say the same for ChatGPT at this stage? Not quite sure. So rather than go through the other slides, I'll just focus on this slide and maybe just talk a little about some of these here. So, of course, I'd be naive to think that generative AI is going away. You know, it's in the public consciousness. It can't be avoided. So how can we bring it into the fold? How can we combine the use of generative AI with what we're trying to do in corpus linguistics and data-driven learning? And essentially, I outlined in my paper 6 methods for doing that. In that generative AI is super, super easy to use. A lot of these issues with complex user interfaces, what has really launched ChatGPT in particular into public consciousness, because it's not that we didn't have large language models before, we had them. They've been around for years. And I was even using OpenAI's GPT API before ChatGPT came out, which requires quite a bit of technical, I guess, expertise to use. But what was it that really launched it? It just looked simple, just a chat interface. That was it. You type in what you want and get what you want. And that's all it took. It's like the iPad with Angry Birds. Everyone could do Angry Birds, right? Suddenly everyone's buying iPad. All you do is pull your finger, that's it. That easy. How did Google take off? We had search engines before Google. Google just said, type in what you want and get the result. That's what ChatGPT does. So if you can develop corpus tools along the same lines, and you take that user interface, the lower technical knowledge required. I don't need to know parts of speech. I don't need to know coding for this or that. I just type in a question, which word goes together with this word, and I will get an answer. Whereas data-driven learning, you still kind of have to think very carefully about what to ask it. So instead of just writing in, does this word appear in another word, you have to like put both words in with a slash in the middle, and that's something that for most people, they don't know how to do. So certainly simplified user experience, I think, is tied in with the technical knowledge. But one of the main things that I've been using with these Australian teachers, and again, it's this word differentiation that pops up, in that the corpus data, you're kind of stuck with what you've got, but then you can tell ChatGPT to make it harder, or make it easier, or simplify it, and so on. Or present this to students with specific learning difficulties, present this to students for whom English is not their main language. And you can do that instantly at the touch of a button. And that's really one of the main benefits, I think. And that's something where Phoebe, for example, has been doing concordancing in ChatGPT for data-driven learning. But then if those concordances are too hard, you can then tell ChatGPT in the next line, can you make these a bit easier? And lo and behold.
The other one is scaling. Obviously, the CorpusMate is 50 million words. So compared to whatever ChatGPT has, it's like, you know, I don't know, I can't even, the grain of sand probably wouldn't even come close, right? So no more kind of results where you type in something and you say, I'm sorry, I don't have a result for that, which you probably already got if you've been trying to use CorpusMate a few times. You won't have that problem with ChatGPT simply because the scale of the data is just unbelievable. And then try to user input as next input. One of the main issues with data-driven learning research, for example, is tracking the corpus queries of what people search for. And I actually was able to do this when I was up in Hong Kong and published a paper on this in Recall 2019. Tracking users' searches and the kinds of things that they were searching for. And we found that there was like a clear difference, for example, between humanities students who were mainly looking at language data and science students who were really looking at the statistical data. And that tells you something about the kind of people who are using the corpora and what they're using it for. Once you've got that information, you can then start to tailor the teaching material accordingly, right? So, but ChatGPT logs everything that we have. And I think you're going to see a ton of research this year using those logs as a methodological data source. So you're going to see quite a few studies saying we tracked ChatGPT logs over 3 months. This is what people were looking for. You're going to see a ton of papers on it. And then probably the biggest one for me in terms of corpus-based language teaching is that there's a big gap between going from corpus results and then translation into teaching materials. You on the other hand, though, put that corpus data in, and now say, give you a lesson plan based on that. Might not be a good plan, but it's a plan nonetheless. But you can develop a few activities out of it instantly. That's something that's always been hard for corpus linguistics. It's labor intensive. It requires a lot of linguistic knowledge and so on. ChatGPT straight away. So I've gone through those. Just to conclude then with the time we've got left, this is probably the most exciting time for corpus linguists, for people who do DDL, for people who've been working with language data, for people who are linguists. Rather than the end of the world, it's actually like the new horizon for us. We all get on board and try not to gatekeep. So most people out there might still say, well, if you're not concordancing, you're not doing DDL. But people like myself, Alex Bolden, Danny Munoz, the other names in the field have all said for many years that you don't need concordances. You don't even need corpora, actually, to do DDL. You can do DDL through various other means, Google, YouTube, and now generative AI. Combining what we can do with corpora and DDL with some of the best features of generative AI is an incredibly exciting prospect. It will really help us bridge the gap between what we've been trying to do for decades and what we might actually be able to do now. And that's super, super exciting. Not leveraging generative AI really does risk leaving us behind. No, we're not naive. We know that we do have to get on board with this, given the huge level of interest and money in generative AI for education at the moment. We'd be fools not to go after it. But rather than out of a job, people like ourselves, people in the room with an interest in linguistics, applied linguistics, corpus linguistics, data-driven learning, whatever your interests are, by taking all of that knowledge and all of that expertise and using generative AI to help put us all on steroids, for want of a better word, then we are really well placed to be able to make a difference in terms of controlling the narrative, making sure that we're working the best for ourselves, for our students, for our research. So it's time to put our money where our mouth is and get started with doing that. And that's pretty much the end of my talk. A couple of slides here, which I might put in the chat. later if I get time. Freely available book on DDL lesson plans that was published last year. It's using language data to learn about language, suitable for learners of different proficiency levels and different language backgrounds. Maybe colleagues in Brazil. And there's still my freely available online DDL training course for English for academic purposes called Improving Writing to Incorporate Data-Driven Learning. And there's also a number of disciplinary DDL aspects in this. It uses CorpusMate in some activities as well as some freely available. Don't have to pay anything. Just log on, get an edX account, and off you go. It takes about 6 to 8 hours. And that leaves me with about 7 minutes for Q&A. Thank you.